Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At my brother Daniel's engagement dinner, just as the server placed a glass of wine in front of me, my mother leaned over, her perfectly manicured hand brushing against my sleeve, and hissed in a tone sharp enough to slice through the carefully rehearsed joy of the evening, "Don't you dare overshadow him with your own news." Her words landed like a slap across the face, and I could almost feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up my neck even though no one else at the long, candlelit table seemed to notice. The restaurant had been reserved entirely for this event, and everything had been orchestrated to make Daniel shine, the string quartet in the corner softly playing something classical enough to feel refined, the towering flower arrangements in the middle of each table, and the little gold-trimmed place cards that spelled out his fiancée's name in calligraphy that looked like it had been chosen to whisper, "Perfect." I sat there with my mouth closed so tightly I could taste blood on my tongue, because what I had wanted, no, what I had been aching to share that evening was my own piece of news, something I had worked toward quietly and without applause for years. A promotion, the kind that changes the course of a career, had landed in my lap after months of grueling late nights, office politics, and second-guessing myself. For once, I had wanted the spotlight not in a vain way, but in a way that said, "See me, acknowledge me, stop pretending that Daniel is the only Carter child worth clapping for." Yet there I was, told yet again that my voice had to stay locked away because Daniel's night mattered more than anything I could possibly bring to the table. It's strange how years of being pushed to the side can be compressed into a single command like that. I remembered birthdays where Daniel blew out candles on cakes I had baked, but no one mentioned my name. Graduations where I was shoved to the far end of photographs while he stood in the center, his arms around smiling parents who looked at him like he was the sun itself. I thought of the job interviews where he had leveraged my contacts, but later joked in front of relatives that I owed him for showing me how things are done. And now here I was, wearing the only dress in my closet that felt halfway appropriate for an occasion that had nothing to do with me, listening to my mother issue a warning as if my very existence posed a threat to Daniel's golden boy image. I gripped the stem of my glass and forced myself to smile, nodding at relatives making small talk across the table. My father sat stiffly at the head, staring at the menu like it contained the secrets of the universe, while Daniel soaked in the attention, his arm draped proudly around Claire, his fiancée. She was radiant in a way that made the entire room lean toward her without her even trying. She laughed at every comment Daniel made, though her laugh never seemed forced. It carried a melody that was both genuine and strangely calculated. Watching her, I wondered how much of Daniel's world she truly knew, how much of the chaos he carried she had willingly signed up for, and how much she was still about to discover. I kept my head down as the appetizers arrived, each plate carefully arranged like a photograph for a food magazine. My mother shot me one more look, the kind that didn't require words, a reminder that I was a guest at my own family's table. I thought about defying her, about raising my glass and casually mentioning that I had just been named senior director, that the corner office with the view of downtown would be mine in a month, and that after years of being told to wait my turn, I had finally earned something no one could strip away from me. The fantasy burned inside me, almost sweet with temptation, but I swallowed it down with a sip of wine that tasted sharper than it should have. The conversation around the table carried on with the usual rhythm of family gatherings, uncles telling long-winded stories, cousins sneaking glances at their phones, and my father making awkward toasts about love and legacy that sounded rehearsed from some magazine article on proper speeches. Daniel beamed, playing his part perfectly, tossing in just enough humility to seem gracious, but not so much that it dimmed the spotlight that had been arranged for him like a halo. Claire smiled, nodding, her hand resting on his arm with a tenderness that seemed almost too deliberate, as if she were acting in a play where she already knew the ending. I was about to excuse myself to the restroom just to breathe when Claire suddenly shifted in her seat. She set down her fork with a quiet precision, looked around the table with eyes that seemed far more serious than moments before, and pressed her hand flat against the white linen. Her voice, when it came, didn't carry the lightness of a fiancé basking in celebration. It carried weight, like a stone dropping into still water. "Actually," she said, her tone calm but unmistakably firm. Everyone needs to hear what he's been keeping from you. The sound of her words hung in the air like smoke. A fork clattered against a plate on the other side of the table, and even the quartet seemed to falter for half a beat before recovering. Daniel's smile froze, his face pale beneath the soft glow of the overhead lights, and in that instant I knew this dinner wasn't about to end with champagne and laughter. It was about to turn into something else entirely, something no one had prepared for, and my mother's warning suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prelude to chaos. Silence crashed over the room, and every pair of eyes turned toward Claire, waiting for the detonation. Claire did not raise her voice or flourish the moment like stage drama. She simply aligned her napkin next to the plate, looked directly at my parents with a composure that felt almost surgical, and said that before everyone toasted to a bright future, she needed to make sure no one in this family was being sold a postcard of a beach that did not exist. Because Daniel had been keeping something from them that she could not carry into a marriage without it festering into something uglier. She explained that over the past year she had discovered late-night withdrawals stacked like dominoes on their shared statements, not the occasional impulsive purchase or a splurge that could be smoothed over by a pay cycle, but a pattern of online betting accounts and sportbook transfers dressed up under merchant names that looked like boutique tech services, with amounts that, taken alone, could be explained away as poor judgment, yet, taken together, formed a ledger of promises he had made to himself and then broken every weekend. She said she had asked him to stop, that he had stopped for a handful of weeks, and then, just when she exhaled, he had opened a new account under a different email and routed it through a card belonging to the small consulting company. He operated out of a co-working space with glass walls and a fern, which sounded respectable at brunch until you glanced at the revenue and realized it was less a business and more a costume. Silence moved around the table like a slow tide as relatives recognized the names of banks they used and the logos of apps their children talked about in the kitchen on game days, and the string quartet paused again, as if the second violinist needed to swallow a lump before continuing, and my mother finally spoke, saying there must be a misunderstanding because Daniel did not do things like that. He was meticulous and responsible and careful with money. And if there were transfers they had to be test charges or some incorrect autopay, and surely Claire would not humiliate him on his engagement night over a clerical error. Claire held her ground, not unkind and not vengeful, and said she had screenshots, dates, and email confirmations, and that she had given Daniel multiple chances to be the one to tell his parents. She said she had watched him put his hand on his heart and swear it would never happen again while his phone vibrated with a deposit notification from a line of credit he had not disclosed, and at that my father inhaled sharply enough for everyone to hear, the sound of a man who knows the shape of a spreadsheet even when it is disguised as a story. Daniel tried to laugh it off, the familiar boyish charm switching on like a hallway light, and he said the numbers were being yanked out of context, that Claire had misunderstood, that yes, he liked to have a little skin in the game, the way other men liked golf or craft beer, and that the so-called company card was just a debit he used to separate expenses because accountants had told him to do that, which might have been plausible if he had not also let slip too quickly that the card had recently declined, and an uncle at the far end raised an eyebrow in the way uncles do when they smell a story with a missing chapter. My mother reached for Daniel's hand like she could erase the room if she squeezed hard enough, and announced that families handle private matters privately, and that none of this needed to be dissected in front of distant relatives and here her eyes cut to me with a little blade of history, opportunists who would love nothing more than to make the night about themselves. I felt heat rise again, not from shame this time, but from the familiar theater of it all, the way my mother could spin a hesitation into a verdict and a question into a betrayal, and I almost swallowed my words the way I had in 100 smaller scenes. Yet something steadier took the wheel, something that said I would not be cast as the chorus while the lead improvised his way back to applause. So I caught the manager's eye as he floated past with the serene smile of a man trained to cross a minefield in polished shoes, and I asked, as politely as a person could ask in front of a table of people pretending the air was not thick, whether the restaurant could please place the entire evening on the Carter House account that Daniel had bragged about setting up here because he was such a valued patron, since it would save everyone the trouble of passing cards back and forth and would keep the celebration seamless. The request slid into the center of the table like a glossy plate, and for a heartbeat no one breathed. The manager, bless him, did not flinch. He checked his little tablet with professional care and explained, gently and publicly, that they did not maintain house accounts except for corporate contracts and that Mr. Daniel Carter had inquired earlier in the week about arranging one, but the application had been declined after a routine assessment, which was unfortunate but not unusual, and of course they could split the bill however the host preferred. A fragile clink rang out as someone's ring touched a glass, and the lie collapsed with a soft, embarrassed sigh, because the charm routine depends on props, and once one prop tips, the whole scene lists to the side. Daniel's mouth opened and closed without sound. My father's gaze sank into the linen as if numbers were printed there in invisible ink, and a cousin's whisper ran down the table like static. I smiled, small, civil, helpful, thanking the manager for clarifying and suggesting we keep it simple by letting Daniel handle the check as the guest of honor, which was both a kindness and a needle, because if he paid smoothly, he salvaged pride. And if he stalled, the room would understand that the future son-in-law with the curated life could not swing dinner without a trick. Claire did not look at me, yet something in her jaw unlocked, as if a weight she had been carrying could finally rest on the table next to the salt. My mother hissed my name under her breath, a warning without a full sentence, while Daniel leaned toward me with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile people use when they want you to know they are memorizing your face for later, and he said, softly enough for only me to hear, that if I wanted to play grown-up tonight, he hoped I had thought through the part where people start asking old questions, because Chicago would not look good on me. The word landed like a thumb on a bruise I had kept hidden even from myself, and, before I could assemble a reply, Claire reached into her clutch, slid a thick envelope onto the linen with an almost tender motion, and said that if anyone needed clarity there were printed statements organized by month and flagged in yellow for charges tied to accounts under Daniel's company email, but that the last page, her voice caught for the first time, was not about money at all. The envelope lay on the linen like an accusation no one wanted to touch, and when Claire slid it toward the center between the water pitcher and the little vase of white roses, my mother responded with the reflex she had perfected over decades of rehearsal. The tilted chin and brittle smile and voice pitched to the exact register of injured dignity as she announced that this spectacle was unnecessary because misunderstandings could be cleared privately, and if anyone here felt tempted to turn a family celebration into a courtroom, then perhaps they did not understand what love and loyalty required, after which she pivoted to me with the grace of a figure skater landing a jump and asked whether I had, in the spirit of my recent career victory, been feeding Claire doubts to make tonight about myself. I did not take the bait, not because I lacked an answer, but because I knew the choreography. If I rose to defend myself, the narrative would shift to my supposed ambition, to the old story about the daughter who could never simply clap for her brother without wishing the applause were for her, and I refused to play that part again, so I opened the envelope calmly, aware of every person at the table pretending to glance away while leaning forward in their chairs, and I began to read. The statements were clipped and clean, bank fonts aligned like marching soldiers, and even without being an accountant I could follow the rhythm. Friday transfers just before tip-off, Saturday consulting reimbursements, Sunday desperation deposits that wore the sad little labels of temporary bridging, and then, tucked behind the columns of charges, a printed email chain that did not belong in any conversation about money at all, because the subject line contained my name alongside the words conduct concern, and the address in the from field was not some anonymous burner, but Daniel's work account with the neat signature block he liked to show off on LinkedIn posts, and the content, written in a tone of weary professionalism that tried too hard to sound reluctant, described a potential conflict of interest related to my candidacy for a leadership role in Chicago, flagged a rumor about a boundary issue with a client that could create reputational risk, and recommended that human Resources slow roll any decision until the matter was discreetly clarified, which, as I felt my chest tighten, was followed by a short reply from a recruiter I remembered all too well, thanking the anonymous industry contact for the heads up and confirming that the search committee would pause the final conversation to avoid optics. I could smell the cheap coffee from that winter, taste the bite of the wind coming off the river when the call never came, and the understanding that I had carried like a stone for years, that I simply had not been good enough. Cracked down the middle to reveal something sour and deliberate, a decision made by a brother who smiled at my birthdays and borrowed my contacts and then, when keeping me small, suited his story, quietly cut the rope. My mother demanded to see the page and then announced, as if reading were the same thing as erasing, that this proved nothing because anyone could fabricate emails if they were determined to ruin a man who had always given more than he took. And that Claire must have found this in some trash folder that misattributed the sender, and that my interpretation was hysterical, a word she enjoyed using because it let her shrink me to a tantrum she could outlast. My father did not take the paper. He watched the candle instead, a tiny flame bending in a draft the rest of us could not feel, and for once I wondered whether he had sensed versions of this before. Small slips and unexplained detours in Daniel's charm that he had chosen to ignore because looking too closely at the map might have required admitting he had been guiding us by the wrong star. Daniel reached across the table and lightly touched the edge of the envelope as if he could pull it back by force of will, then laughed, too loudly. And a half beat late, and said that he had a lot of emails and sometimes interns sent things from his account and sometimes recruiters asked for confidential feedback and sometimes people misread tone, and none of that had anything to do with family or love, and anyway, why were we all letting paper ruin a night meant to celebrate a life he was building with a woman he adored? I looked at Claire then, and she met my eyes with a steadiness that acknowledged both the damage done and the damage still to come, and in that small exchange I understood that she had not placed the envelope on the table to destroy Daniel for sport, but because she had spent months trying to build on ground that kept swallowing her footing, and there was no house you could raise on a sinkhole, not even if you decorated it beautifully and invited everyone you loved to watch you cut the ribbon. The room buzzed with the kind of murmurs that rustle at church when a sermon slips too close to home, and an aunt I barely liked put her hand over mine for a second in a gesture that said she had girls of her own, and she recognized the taste of this particular poison, the one that asks women to smile while they are being made smaller, to forgive while the knife is still warm. Revenge, for me, did not wear the dress of public spectacle, at least not tonight. It arrived instead as a precise adjustment of the room's gravity, a move so polite it could pass for kindness. Because when the server leaned in to ask whether we were ready for the first toast, I stood before my mother could object, lifted my glass without trembling, and addressed Claire in a voice that carried to every corner of the private room, thanking her for her honesty and welcoming her to our family by offering something I knew Daniel would hear as a shot across the bow, an open invitation to stay with me anytime she needed space while wedding planning, because my door was never locked and my spare key would be in her purse before dessert. A promise wrapped in hospitality that also told the room, and Daniel most of all, that his control of the narrative had been interrupted, and that if he wanted to keep a fiancée, he would have to stop treating women like furniture he could arrange for his comfort. Claire's mouth softened with something like relief. People murmured approval at the generosity, and my mother's smile cracked at the edges because she understood, better than anyone, that I had redrawn a border without raising my voice. Daniel leaned close again, the scent of cologne and fear layered together, and he said that if I kept inserting myself into things that did not concern me, I would regret revisiting Chicago, a place he insisted had nearly ruined me, while Claire, still standing, pressed the last page of the packet with 2 fingers and said, in a tone that folded soft and steel together, that we had not yet reached the part that mattered most, because the final document was not about bank accounts or career sabotage at all. It concerned a woman whose name I did not recognize, a woman connected to Chicago in a way Daniel would prefer we never discuss at this table, and as everyone turned to her and the door at the far end opened on a gust of colder air from the hallway, A figure hesitated on the threshold, as if searching for courage, and the string quartet finally stopped playing. The woman in the doorway hesitated the way people do when they have rehearsed 100 versions of a sentence, and none of them feel safe in the light, and when the maitre d' guided her 2 slow steps into the room, I recognized her not from holiday cards or graduations, but from a headshot on a corporate page I had studied late one winter night in a studio apartment that hummed like a refrigerator. Because this was Mara Jensen, the human resources director from Chicago who had smiled in a short video about mentorship and then never returned my final call, and seeing her made the whole city rise in my throat like a tide I had been told to forget. Claire, still standing, thanked her with a nod that said there had been careful conversations behind the scenes, and Mara, polite enough to ask if now was appropriate while fully aware there was no appropriate left, explained to my parents that she was in town for a conference and had been contacted by Claire after a quiet exchange through a friend, that she did not relish speaking at an engagement dinner but believed in context, and that she could confirm the email chain in the packet was not fabricated, because their internal log showed a message routed from Daniel's work account through a personal address that, for reasons she would not speculate on here, had been masked when it reached her team. My mother tightened her jaw until the lipstick line thinned to an angry seam and said this was harassment dressed up as community service, that strangers had no right to invade a family table with bureaucratic gossip, and that if the so-called log existed it probably reflected a prank by an assistant or a malicious ex-colleague, after which she flicked her eyes at me as if the word malicious were being tested for fit. Daniel spread his hands like a man with nothing to hide and suggested we stop giving oxygen to people who clearly wanted a piece of his life. He was building a future, he said. He was learning from mistakes, and more importantly, he loved Claire, which ought to count for something since love, as every song insists, changes men even when spreadsheets do not. Mara kept her tone even and said love did count, that most systems department heads were romantics in private even while signing compliance forms, but that her job was to describe, not to judge, and the description here was simple. An industry contact had asked her team to slow a leadership offer to a candidate named Emily Carter using language about reputational risk, and that contact, traced through verification steps she would not bore us with, was Daniel, which meant whatever explanation followed could not begin at accident. There is a funny thing about rage when it finally finds a level surface. It stops splashing, it lays itself down like a sheet of water that reflects the ceiling clearly enough to make everyone stare at their own face. And in that calm I realized I did not want to throw a drink or yank off a tablecloth or deliver a monologue that would be applauded on the drive home and forgotten by morning. I wanted to make a small, precise correction that would continue working long after dessert, the way a compass nudged, "We'll send a ship to a different shore." So I took a breath, opened our sprawling family group thread, the one named for vacation photos and cousin updates that inevitably devolved into requests for recipes, and I placed, without commentary, 3 images at the very top. The page with the transfers Claire had flagged in yellow, the email chain where my name was linked to the pause request, and a polite note addressed to Daniel from a lending office about a line of credit nearing its limit, which I had missed earlier under the stack. Phones lit up around the table like a constellation deciding to reveal itself, and a wave of quiet gasps ran from aunt to uncle to cousin to godparent as the polite veneer of selective hearing melted into the more democratic shock of proof that arrives all at once and cannot be stuffed back into an envelope. Daniel leaned toward me again, the edge in his voice sanded to a whisper that hurt the way a paper cut hurts, promising that I was playing with fire I did not understand, that Chicago had skeletons of mine as well if people started digging late sign-offs. A client who felt I had been too assertive, a performance review line that could be spun if someone needed a story, and I almost laughed because the worst thing that had happened to my career there was that someone used my ambition as a weapon, and then called the bruise my fault. Claire, who had not cried and had not sat down, turned to my parents and said there was one more piece of context before they decided whether tonight was a misunderstanding or a map, and she gestured to Mara, who stepped aside in a practiced move to create a small path between chairs and the table, and through that gap came a second figure I did not recognize, a woman in her late 20s holding a slim folder to her chest the way people carry breakable things when they do not trust their hands. She introduced herself as Lila Reyes in a voice that trembled and then steadied, said she had worked as a contractor for a Chicago client Daniel pursued during a period when he was traveling there frequently, that he had offered mentorship, which had quickly become a tension she did not know how to refuse without harming her prospects, and that when she tried to set a boundary, he pivoted from charming to watchful in a way that made her car keys feel small in her palm. She said there had been a clinic visit after a night that blurred at the edges, a form that required an emergency contact, and a name she had not given somehow ended up on the line where hers should have been, which mattered for reasons she would keep to herself. Except that the invoice Claire had placed in the packet showed Daniel as the contact of record at an address tied to his consulting office, and yes, the clinic had misfiled and corrected it later, but not before insurance kicked off. A series of questions that made her manager ask whether everything in her life was in order. The room held its breath with the awful intimacy that descends when something private and bodily touches a table full of people who came for cake and photos. And I saw my father's shoulders collapse in a way that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the feeling a person has when the boat you have been polishing turns out to have a hole. I did not want to be a savior, and I did not want to be a martyr. I wanted balance, and if the universe was taking orders, a little elegance. So when the waiter returned with a tray of flutes and the patient smile of a man halfway through a shift he would tell his roommates about, I stood again and offered a toast that sounded harmless enough to be applauded by people who needed a script, thanking the staff, thanking the musicians, and then, with every eye on the glass in my hand, dedicating the party favors, those little boxes of chocolates my mother adored, to a donation made in Daniel's name to a national gambling recovery hotline. Because families help families get honest, and, for the registry, offering a prepaid consultation with a lawyer known for building fair prenuptial agreements that protect both partners' futures when emotions run high and numbers run wild. The room laughed in the uncomfortable way people laugh when truth arrives dressed as humor, and my mother's smile shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. Daniel's face drained, not because of the money, I doubted the donation would ruin him, but because my toast had repositioned him in the story from golden groom to man on a ledge who might yet choose the right step if enough hands pointed toward solid ground. Claire set her glass down without drinking, turned to Daniel with a tenderness that made it worse, and asked whether he would like to explain, not the ledger or the email, or even the clinic form, but the name Lila had just spoken in a whisper. An older name that hovered above all of this like a storm front from another state, and as the quartet, sensing that music would be an intrusion, folded their bows, the hallway door opened again to admit a final guest I had not expected, a man carrying a small sealed envelope addressed, in neat block letters, to me. The courier looked like any hotel employee trained to be invisible until summoned, yet the small sealed envelope he carried with my name in block letters carried a gravity that shifted the room's posture. And when he explained that a guest in the lobby had asked him to deliver it now, not later, because timing mattered more than etiquette, I felt a chill of recognition that belonged to Chicago winters rather than this overheated dining room where roses were beginning to wilt under candle heat. I slid a finger under the flap and found, not a threat or apology, but a single-page letter on heavy paper that smelled faintly of a law office and carried the tidy signature of Nora Fielding, the general counsel from the Chicago client whose name had followed me around like a rumor I could not shake. She wrote that, upon reviewing archived metadata at the request of an internal audit, she had discovered that the industry contact, who flagged me as a reputational risk, had logged into their feedback portal from an address range used by Daniel's co-working space, that the submission included language pasted from a performance review of a different employee in another city, and that, while she could not comment on personnel matters, she wished to correct the record where it touched my name, because she had recently learned about a clinic invoice that listed Daniel as someone's emergency contact, and the overlap concerned her enough to prompt this clarity. There was a postscript, polite and surgical, confirming that a formal letter clearing me would reach my former recruiter by morning, and while that line should have tasted like vindication, it stung like salt because the apology arrived years late, after a city had already decided who I was. I handed the page to my father first, not to punish him, but to let him hold the cold metal of a truth he had sensed, but never named, and as he read and passed it to my mother, whose breath shortened the way it does when denial runs out of oxygen, I watched Daniel's eyes flick over the watermark, calculate angles, and land back on me with the expression of someone who had mapped every exit and discovered the floor plan had changed. Claire did not reach for the letter. She kept her gaze on Daniel with the kind of quiet compassion that only makes a guilty person feel more cornered, and she asked, without raising her voice, whether he would like to speak now about Nora. Not because there had been romance. She said she did not care about gossip masquerading as tragedy, but because there had been leverage, and leverage had bled into every other decision until it touched even the way he talked about his sister in rooms where her name should have been safe. Daniel tried one more story, the kind of shapeshifter tale that feeds on doubt and calls itself nuance, saying that everyone makes survival choices, that the market had been brutal, that he had taken on a piece of business that came with expectations, that a flag on a candidate is not the same thing as a sword, and that Chicago had never been personal, which was an interesting defense against a charge no one had quite finished voicing. My mother told him to stop talking, but she said it without heat, and I realized the engine of her certainty had finally sputtered, because when pride is built on a spotless narrative it does not survive smudges. It simply runs out of fuel and coasts to a halt in the middle of traffic. The quartet began packing their instruments slowly, as if afraid to break the spell of listening, and in that sloping quiet I understood that the final cut would not be delivered by shouting or by throwing a ring into a glass of champagne. It would arrive as something small and irreversible that reorganized the story around the one person who had been instructed, for years, to make herself smaller. I stood and clicked my glass once, not to demand attention but to excuse us all from pretending, and then I offered the toast I had been writing, in some secret corner of myself, since the winter when my phone stayed dark, thanking everyone for coming, thanking the staff for patience, and then, because revenge can be polite when it wants to be, congratulating Daniel and Claire on a new, honest beginning by announcing a gift that sounded like generosity and functioned like a locksmith, a fully paid, month-to-month lease in Claire's name alone for a quiet one-bedroom 3 blocks from her office with a doorman who did not ask questions, a door code I had already texted her, and a small trust account, funded that afternoon and accessible only to her. To untangle any joint obligations without drama, which I described as a practical head start because marriages, when they work, are built on 2 people who could leave and choose to stay. Polite applause rose like steam while the meeting sank in, and Daniel's smile went waxy, because what I had put on the table was not a scene but a set of keys, and keys change the way people move through a house. Claire did not look stunned or grateful or vindicated. She looked relieved in the specific way people do when they realize the path they suspected existed has been swept clear of glass, and she said, with a tenderness that did not soften the blade, that she would take a few days to breathe, to read, to listen to herself without the chorus, and that any wedding planning would pause until love could be disentangled from management. Lila, who had stood near the door as if proximity to escape were oxygen, squeezed my hand hard enough to anchor me and whispered that she had a ride waiting, that she would be all right. That sometimes the most radical act is to leave quietly without explaining your bruises to people who prefer metaphors. Mara slipped me a card and said to call if I wanted everything documented in a way that would not require reliving it every holiday. My father asked for a pen like a man finally prepared to keep records he could trust. My mother stared at the envelope with my name and then at Daniel with an expression I had never seen before, something like respect complicated by grief, because she understood that while she had spent years guarding the family myth, I had just saved what could be saved without setting the house on fire. Daniel followed me to the coat rack with the lopsided smile of a boy who still believed in last looks, and he asked, almost gently, what it would take to make me put tonight back in the box where secrets go to sleep. And I told him there was no box and there were no sleeping secrets. There was only daylight and the work people do when they get honest, and that if he wanted a blueprint he could start with a call to the hotline I had funded in his name. A clean ledger sent to my father by morning. An email to Nora and to my old recruiter correcting the last lie, and an apology to Lila that did not ask for a reply. He nodded like a man learning a new language in real time, then tried one more card, reminding me of the things family should not broadcast, and I said we had already broadcast for years, only the channel had always been tuned to him. Tonight I was merely changing the station. Outside the private room the hallway smelled like lemon polish and relief, and the elevator made that soft hotel chime that sounds like permission, and as the doors closed on the cluster of faces, some angry, some grateful, some calculating, I felt something I refused to call triumph even though it hummed in my ribs like a held note. I called it balance, and then, because I know the world, I called it a beginning with 1,000 ways to go wrong. In the cab I checked my phone and saw the recruiter's auto-reply promising contact in the morning and a message from an unknown number containing a single line, "There is more if you want it," which could have been Nora or someone else entirely. And I stared at it until the screen dimmed, thinking about keys and ledgers and how nothing ever ends cleanly. Then I typed "not tonight," slipped the phone face down on my lap, and watched the city slide by, wondering whether I had finally stepped out of my brother's narrative or simply written myself into a new one where victory and mercy look, from a distance, like the same light.